In 1896, a European army marched into Africa, fully armed, fully confident, and absolutely certain of victory. They had cannons, they had rifles, they had the full might of a colonial empire behind them. What they did not have was any idea what was waiting for them on the other side of that mountain. His name was Menelik II. And if you have never heard of him, that is exactly the problem. History has a habit of leaving out the stories that do not fit the version it wants to tell. And the story of Menelik II is one of the greatest stories that has ever been left out of a classroom. This is the man who, as a boy, was taken prisoner by a rival emperor and held captive for over a decade. This is the man who escaped, rebuilt a kingdom, and then united an entire nation, all before the age of 45. This is the man who, when the full military force of a European colonial power came marching into Ethiopia, did not flee, did not surrender, and did not negotiate from a position of fear. He fought, he won, and the world has never fully recovered from the shock of it. This is not mythology. Every moment of this story is documented history. The Battle of Adwa, the climax of Menelik's life, is considered by historians to be the greatest military defeat of a European colonial army by an African force in the history of colonialism. It happened. It was real. And the fact that most people still do not know his name says everything about the way history has been told. Stay right here, because this story is about to change the way you see African history, and maybe the way you see the world. Subscribe now. More stories like this are coming, and you do not want to miss them. To understand Menelik II, you first need to understand the world he entered in 1844. Europe was on the move. For decades, the major powers of the continent, Britain, France, Belgium, Portugal, Germany, and Italy, had been slowly tightening their grip on Africa. By the mid-1800s, that grip had become a stranglehold. They called it colonization. In practice, it was the organized seizure of land, resources, and people, backed by military force and justified by a belief that European civilization had not just the right, but the duty to rule over others. This period became known as the Scramble for Africa. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 made it official. European nations sat around a table in Germany and divided up the African continent between themselves, without a single African leader in the room, without a single African voice at the table. By the end of the 19th century, over 90% of Africa was under European control. Only 2 nations on the entire continent would survive the colonial era as independent states. One was Liberia, the other was Ethiopia. And the reason Ethiopia survived, the reason it stood alone when every other nation fell, had everything to do with one man. Menelik was born Salim Mariam on August 17, 1844 in the town of Ankober. His father was Haile Melekot, king of Shewa, a powerful regional kingdom in the heart of Ethiopia. From birth, Menelik was surrounded by politics, power, and conflict. He was just 11 years old when his father died, fighting against the emperor of all Ethiopia, a formidable ruler named Tewodros II. After defeating the Shewan forces, Tewodros did something calculated. He did not kill the young prince. He took him. Menelik was brought to the emperor's mountain fortress at Magdala and kept there as a royal hostage, a symbol of Shewan submission and a tool of political control. He would remain there for more than 10 years. To anyone watching from the outside, this looked like the end of Menelik's story before it had even begun. A captive prince in an enemy emperor's fortress, cut off from his kingdom, with no clear path to freedom. But Menelik used every single day of those 10 years. He watched how Tewodros ruled, how he commanded armies, how he managed rivals, how he made decisions under pressure. He learned the mechanics of power from one of the most capable men of his era. He studied military strategy not from a textbook, but from inside the tent of the man who had beaten his father. In 1865, at 20 years old, Menelik escaped from Magdala. He returned to Shewa, declared himself its rightful king, and began rebuilding. The education was over. The work had begun. The years that followed were defined by patience and precision. Menelik did not move recklessly. He understood that to challenge the wider Ethiopian empire, he needed a foundation that could not be shaken. He spent nearly 2 decades consolidating his power in Shewa and surrounding regions. He made alliances with neighboring kingdoms, some through negotiation, some through marriage, and some through military force when necessary. He was practical about it. He did not make enemies out of people who could be made into allies. But he was also doing something that would prove absolutely critical in the years ahead. He was arming Ethiopia. Menelik understood more clearly than almost any other African leader of his generation that the difference between a nation that survived the colonial era and one that did not came down to military capability. He bought rifles, he bought artillery, he purchased modern weapons from European traders, including, with deep irony, from Italy itself, and he stockpiled them. He was not preparing for small border conflicts. He was preparing for something on a national scale. In 1889, Emperor Johannes IV was killed in battle against Sudanese forces at the Battle of Metemma. The throne of Ethiopia was open. Menelik stepped forward, and on November 3, 1889, he was crowned Emperor of all Ethiopia, Menelik II, King of Kings. The boy, who had been taken prisoner in a mountain fortress, now sat on the oldest throne in Africa. He was 45 years old, and the hardest test of his life was still ahead. The same year Menelik was crowned, 1889, Italy came to him with a proposal. The two nations would sign a formal treaty of friendship. Italy would recognize Menelik as emperor. There would be defined borders between Italian-controlled Eritrea and Ethiopia. There would be trade, cooperation, and peace. The document was called the Treaty of Wuchale, and Menelik signed it. What he did not immediately know was that Italy had written two different versions of the treaty, one in Italian, one in Amharic, and the two versions did not say the same thing. In the Italian version, Article 17 stated that Ethiopia was required to conduct all of its foreign affairs through Italy. This made Ethiopia a de facto Italian protectorate, a dependent state, not a sovereign one. Italy used this version to declare to the rest of Europe that Ethiopia was now under Italian protection. In a single clause, they had tried to quietly absorb Ethiopia without firing a single shot. In the Amharic version, the version Menelik had read and signed, Article 17 simply said that Ethiopia could choose to use Italy as a channel for its foreign affairs if it wished to. Completely optional, a matter of convenience, not a transfer of sovereignty. When Menelik discovered the discrepancy, he did not hesitate. He formally rejected the Italian interpretation and notified the major European powers that Ethiopia was and would remain a fully independent nation. Italy refused to accept the rejection. The diplomatic exchange continued for years. Letters, negotiations, ultimatums, and none of it resolved the dispute. By 1895, Italy had had enough of talking. They began moving troops into Ethiopian territory. The war that had been building for years was now unavoidable. Menelik's response was immediate and total. On September 17, 1895, he issued a mobilization proclamation to every corner of the empire. It was one of the most powerful documents of his reign. In it, he told his people plainly, a foreign nation had tried to deceive Ethiopia, to steal its sovereignty, to reduce it to a colony. He told them that this was not a dispute between kings. It was an attack on the entire Ethiopian people and on the nation's God-given right to govern itself. And he called on every man who could fight to come. They came. From the highlands of Tigray to the plains of Shiwa, from Harar in the east to the western provinces, soldiers, warriors, farmers who had never seen a battlefield, noblemen with their personal regiments, they all answered the call. By early 1896, Menelik had assembled a fighting force estimated at between 70,000 and 100,000 people. It was one of the largest armies ever raised in 19th century Africa, and crucially, they were armed. The years Menelik had spent stockpiling weapons from European suppliers had paid off. His forces carried modern rifles, Remingtons, Winchesters, Gras rifles. They had artillery. They were not going into this fight with spears against cannons. They were going into it on near equal terms in terrain they knew completely. Marching with the army was Empress Taitu Bedel, Menelik's wife and co-ruler, a formidable political and military figure who commanded her own regiment of soldiers and whose strategic counsel Menelik valued deeply. She would play a direct role in the battle ahead. The Ethiopian army moved north through the highlands toward the Tigray region, where the Italian forces were massing near the town of Adwa. The stage was set. The Italian force that marched toward Adwa on the morning of March 1, 1896, numbered approximately 17,500 soldiers. Their commander was General Oreste Baratieri, a veteran officer who had led campaigns in Eritrea and believed the Ethiopian army, however large, could be broken by European discipline and firepower. Baratieri divided his force into 4 columns, commanded by Generals Vittorio da Bormida, Giuseppe Arimondi, Vittorio Elena, and Pietro Albertone. The plan was for all 4 columns to advance through the mountain passes overnight and reach their designated positions before dawn, giving the Italians the high ground for a coordinated morning attack. The plan collapsed almost immediately. The maps the Italians were using were wrong. The terrain around Adwa, ridges, valleys, ravines, dry riverbeds, was more complex and more treacherous than any Italian chart showed. In the darkness, the columns lost contact with each other. They could not signal. They could not coordinate. They did not know where the other columns were, and they did not know that they were already being watched. Menelik had scouts across every high point in the area. He had spent weeks studying the terrain and the Italian positions. He knew exactly which passes the Italian columns were using, and he knew, before the sun came up, that they were separated. He moved. Ras Michael and his forces struck the column led by General Albertone first in the early morning hours, hitting them with devastating speed. Albertone's column was cut apart. The general himself was captured. The first Italian column had ceased to function as a fighting unit before the full battle had even started. General da Bormida's column moved to support Albertone and walked directly into a coordinated ambush. His forces were struck on multiple sides simultaneously. Da Bormida was killed in the fighting. Empress Taitu Bedel personally commanded forces that cut off the Italian retreat routes and secured key water sources, forcing the 3rd column under Arimondi into a position where they could neither advance nor retreat effectively. By mid-morning, all 3 Italian columns that had made contact with Ethiopian forces were in catastrophic disorder. The 4th column, under Elena, attempted to form a defensive position but was overwhelmed. The battle lasted the better part of a full day. When it ended, approximately 6,000 Italian soldiers were dead, among them 3 generals. Roughly 3,000 more were taken prisoner. An estimated 2,000 Askari soldiers, Eritrean troops fighting for Italy, were also killed. It was, by every military measure, a total defeat. Ethiopian casualties were significant. Historical estimates range from 4,000 to 7,000 killed and many more wounded. Victory did not come without cost, but the Ethiopian army had held. The Italian army had broken. The Battle of Adwa was over, and nothing in the history of colonialism would ever look quite the same again. The news reached Rome within days, and it was received like a catastrophe, because that is exactly what it was. The Italian government of Prime Minister Francesco Crispi fell immediately. There were mass protests in the streets. The idea that a modern European army equipped with the best weapons of the era had been decisively defeated by an African force was not just a military shock, it was an ideological earthquake. The entire intellectual architecture of colonialism rested on the assumption that European power was irresistible. Adwa proved it was not. In the Treaty of Addis Ababa, signed in October 1896, Italy formally renounced the Treaty of Wuchale and recognized Ethiopia as a fully independent sovereign state. No protectorate, no conditions, no compromise. Menelik had demanded sovereignty from the beginning, and sovereignty is exactly what the treaty delivered. But the impact went far beyond the Italy-Ethiopia relationship. Across the African continent and across the African diaspora in the Americas and the Caribbean, the news of Adwa traveled with electric speed. Pan-Africanist thinkers and activists pointed to it immediately as proof of what had been argued for years, that African people were not inferior, that African nations were capable of self-governance, and that the colonial order could be resisted and overcome. For generations of independence movements in the 20th century, in Ghana, in Kenya, in South Africa, in the Caribbean, Adwa was a reference point. It was the answer to the colonial argument that Africa needed to be governed by outsiders. It was the counter-evidence, written in history, that no one could erase. The war was won. But Menelik's ambition was never only military. In the years following Adwa, he turned his full energy toward building the modern Ethiopian state. In 1896, he established Addis Ababa as the permanent capital, a city that continues to serve as both the capital of Ethiopia and the headquarters of the African Union to this day. He built Ethiopia's first railway, the Franco-Ethiopian Railway, connecting Addis Ababa to the port of Djibouti. giving landlocked Ethiopia access to global trade routes. He established the country's first bank, its first modern hospital, its first postal service. He created a council of ministers, a formal cabinet government, that began the process of replacing the loose feudal structure of regional kingdoms with a centralized modern state. He also expanded Ethiopia's territory significantly, incorporating regions to the south, east, and west that roughly correspond to the borders of modern Ethiopia. By the end of his reign, Ethiopia was more than twice the size it had been when he inherited the throne. Foreign powers that had once dismissed Ethiopia now sought formal diplomatic relations. France, Britain, Russia, and the United States all established embassies in Addis Ababa. Menelik received their ambassadors as an equal, because that is what he was. Menelik II suffered a series of strokes beginning in 1906, which gradually incapacitated him. He died on December 12, 1913. He was 69 years old. Ethiopia remained independent through the entire colonial era. When Italy attempted a second invasion under Mussolini in 1935, Ethiopia resisted again, and though it fell temporarily under occupation, it was liberated in 1941 and restored to independence. The spirit of Adwa did not die with Menelik. It was already too deeply embedded in the identity of the nation. In 1963, Emperor Haile Selassie, who continued Menelik's imperial line, hosted the founding of the Organization of African Unity in Addis Ababa. That body became the African Union, and it remains headquartered in Addis Ababa today. The choice of location was not arbitrary, it was a statement. Africa's premier continental institution sits in the only major nation that was never colonized, the nation Menelik built and defended. Every year, on March 2nd, Ethiopia observes Adwa Victory Day as a national public holiday. Across the country, there are marches, ceremonies, and celebrations marking the anniversary of the battle. In the capital, Menelik's statue stands at one of the city's major intersections. His face appears on Ethiopian currency. But his legacy is not limited to Ethiopia. In Jamaica, in the United States, in South Africa, in Brazil, wherever African communities built identities of resistance and pride, Adwa has been a touchstone. Rastafari theology, which venerates Ethiopia as a holy land and African liberation as a spiritual mission, drew direct inspiration from the fact that Ethiopia had stood free. Marcus Garvey, the Jamaican Pan-Africanist whose ideas shaped black nationalist movements across the 20th century, pointed to Ethiopia explicitly as the proof of what Africa could be. Menelik II was not a perfect man. His expansion of the empire came with costs borne by the peoples he incorporated, some through force. History, when it is honest, holds all of that together. The full picture is complex. But what is not complex is what he accomplished at Adwa. Against a colonial power that had divided an entire continent between itself and its neighbors, he said no. He backed that no with preparation, strategy, and the unified will of a nation. And he made it stick. That is what changed history. Menelik II was not just a king who won a battle. He was a man who refused to accept a world that had already decided what his people were worth. He outthought his enemies, outprepared them, outfought them. And when it was over, he built something that outlasted all of them. The question history always asks is, what kind of person changes the world? And the answer, again and again, is the same. Someone who refuses to accept the world as it is. Menelik refused. And because of that, an entire continent stood a little taller. If this story hit you the way it hits every person who discovers it for the first time, share it. These are the stories that belong in classrooms, in conversations, on every screen they can reach. Hit the like button if this was worth your time. Subscribe if you want more stories that history forgot to tell you. And click the next video right now, because where we go next is just as extraordinary.